The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. You have multiplied the nation, you have increased its joy. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace.
Will you bow your heads and pray with me? Father, as we take this time to study your word, to celebrate the gift of your Son, Jesus, I pray that you'd open our hearts and our minds. Lord, I pray that you'd speak and you'd move today. I pray that this message would be your message and not mine, that in any way possible I might decrease, that you would increase, that these words would be helpful, that they would be useful, that your Spirit would stir our hearts and our minds as we remember the gift that you have given us. In your name we pray. Amen. Christmas season 2021 is finally here. And I'm not sure that it could have come at a better time, honestly. See, this last week, I got together with family for Thanksgiving, as many of you did, and we reflected over the year and what's happened and where we've been from last Thanksgiving to this Thanksgiving and what's gone on. And, you know, I found myself in many conversations thinking that an event had happened 5 years ago that happened earlier this year. 2021 has not felt like 1 year. It's felt like 3 years or 4 years or 5 years. And honestly, many of us at this time of year expect to feel joy and happiness, and you know, it's the most wonderful time of the year. We're supposed to be merry and bright, and this season, it feels like that's not the atmosphere. 2021's been a hard year for many of us. And so this year, maybe more than most, we need the message of Christmas. And maybe even more so, we need the message of Advent. See, for centuries, Christians haven't just been celebrating December 25th. They haven't just been celebrating Christmas, they've been celebrating the season of Advent, which spans the 4 Sundays leading up to Christmas. Advent is a Latin word. It means arrival. And we use the term Advent for other things, especially technology. You can think about the advent of the automobile. When cars first started being invented, you can think about the advent of the cell phone or the advent of the internet. It's just a word that means arrival. And that's what the Advent season is all about. It's about the arrival of God incarnate. And maybe more so than what happens after the arrival of Jesus, Advent is specifically about what happened before. And it's not something we often talk about. A lot of times we focus on the sentimentality of Christmas. We talk about the Christmas movies and the Christmas songs and the beautiful Christmas lights and all the beautiful things that go into Christmas. And we expect to feel this joy. We expect to feel this gratitude. We expect to feel all of these great things. And what so often we miss is that there was a before when it came to Christmas. There was a BC. Before Christ. And that's what we're going to talk about over these next several weeks is what does life look like before Christ and what does Christ do? If you've been with us the last several weeks, you know we've been walking through the book of Luke. We've been walking through the first chapter, really setting the scene for the Christmas story. And at this point in Luke, when we get back into our series, we'll actually jump back into the birth story, into the birth narrative of Jesus. But before we do that, I want to take a step back and talk about what does the birth actually do in our lives? What difference does Jesus' birth make? I think a lot of us can answer the question, what does Jesus' death do for us? But I'm not sure that many of us could answer the question, what does Jesus' life do for us? And so for the next several weeks, we'll be talking about what Christians have been talking about for centuries. 4 themes that Advent celebrates. The first is joy. Next week, we'll talk about hope, and then love, and then peace. 4 things that Jesus' arrival on this earth actually do for us. The difference that it makes in our lives today. And we're going to do that by talking about different prophecies in the book of Isaiah. See, Isaiah was a book written in the Old Testament thousands of years before Jesus. And what's significant about Isaiah is he wasn't just predicting a coming king. He was writing to a people who lived in darkness. Writing to a people who lived in turmoil and chaos and political strife and personal tragedy, who lived and really much a similar situation that we have today. I've been working on this sermon series for quite some time now, and the further I dove down into Isaiah and his prophecies and what he was going through back then, I've realized that maybe there's never been a more timely series than the one we're going through right now. So we're going to be looking through the book of Isaiah to highlight these different themes. And the first prophecy we're talking about, the first text that we're going to look at, comes to us in Isaiah chapter 9, starting in verse 2. It says, "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them a light has shone." The layout of my house is such that there's really just one major hallway. When you walk in, you walk into the living room, and next door is the kitchen, and then there's one hallway that leads to the bathroom and several bedrooms. But for whatever reason, when they decided to do the electrical work, they only put one light switch in the hallway. And it's at the front of the hallway, and my bedroom is at the back of the hallway, which wasn't maybe the greatest electrical design ever created, because it means you have to turn the light off to walk to the bedroom so that their hallway light isn't on all night. Which isn't the biggest problem, except for the fact that when you wake up in the middle of the night having to go to the bathroom, there's no light switch between the bedroom to the hallway. So you find yourself walking through, stumbling, trying not to wake up your spouse, even though you're tripping over every single thing in your way because you're in complete darkness. And Sarah and I actually had to go out and we bought a little $1 nightlight to plug into our hallway outlet so that we didn't have to try and fumble through the hallway every single time we woke up in the middle of the night. Because when we walk in darkness, we tend to stumble. You don't have to be an expert in biblical prophecy to understand what this verse is talking about. Those who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Nobody wants to live in darkness. We all want to live in the light. And normally at this point, if I was giving this sermon about 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I would have spent a decent portion of this sermon trying to convince you that you and I are the ones living in darkness. But this year, I don't know that I really have to spend much time trying to convince you of that. Because we're at Thanksgiving and we're reminded of the tension going on in your family. You're reminded of the conflict of that person that was sitting across the table from you, or maybe you were reminded of the conflict of the family member that didn't even show up and maybe hasn't for years. You've been reminded of your own marital problems. The fact that you don't know where your marriage is going, it's in struggle. There's instability at the workplace. You don't know what your job's going to look like over the coming years. COVID has changed everything, and that includes your job, and you don't know what's next for you. It's reminded you of your relationship with your kids and how that's not where you want it to be. Of your friendships. And above all of that, in the midst of all of that, in the midst of your personal tragedy, we've got political strife going on everywhere you look. It's almost impossible to find any good news anymore. And then even in the midst of that, you have your own personal mental battle. Stats everywhere showing us that depression and anxiety are only ever rising. You have a war that you're fighting in your own mind. I don't have to spend a whole lot of time trying to convince you that you and I are the ones living in darkness. We know that. The hope of the book of Isaiah is not that we continue to live in darkness, but that on us a light has shone. That there's a great light that has entered into your life and into my life. And the results of that life comes to us in verse 3. It says, "You have multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy." Joy. We don't talk about joy a whole lot in church. You don't expect to come in and hear sermons on joy and the importance of joy. If we're being honest, most of the time our stereotypical vision of a Christian is somebody who's very serious, who's very much by the rule. We don't really think of churches as increasing joy. We more think of it as killing joy. We don't think of a God as a guy who wants to give us happiness, but who wants to take away the happiness that we have. We don't talk about joy a lot in church, and yet here the light that shines in the darkness is one that's going to bring us joy. And I think maybe part of the reason we don't talk about joy very often is because we don't really know what joy is. Merriam-Webster defines joy in this way. We've got it on the screen. No, okay. It's an expressed state of happiness. Oh, it is on the screen. It's just not on my screen. All right, for you guys, it's a feeling of great happiness. That's what joy is. And yet, why don't we feel that more often? C.S. Lewis says it this way. He says, joy is an unsatisfied desire, which is itself more desirable than any other satisfaction. What he's saying there is once you feel joy, that's all you will ever crave again. We get that moment, that glimpse of joy, and that's what we spend the rest of our life chasing. And you don't have to look very hard to find article after article that will tell you how to improve joy in your life. You just need to exercise more. You need to get that shot of dopamine. You need to get that serotonin level rising. You need to get out in the sun more often. Get out in nature. Read a nice book. Spend an afternoon in your hammock, and that'll increase the joy in your life. But when you do those things, you realize that joy is fleeting. You might have it for that moment, but it disappears. And that's not the joy that we're talking about, because that's not real, true joy. A pastor by the name of Timothy Keller defines joy this way, and I think it's a much better definition of joy. He says, joy is a delight in God for the sheer beauty and worth of who He is. Joy is not found in your own feelings, but it's found in who God is. Not in who you are, but in who God is. And that's the joy that we're talking about. This light that shines in the darkness, it gives us joy because it shows us who our God is. Tim Keller will actually go on in this quote to say that the opposite of joy is despair and hopelessness. And there's a counterfeit to joy. There's something that looks like the real thing that's not the real thing. And that's this elation, this happiness, this momentary feeling that we can feel in a moment. It's a counterfeit. It's something that comes in a moment but disappears over time. But real joy doesn't disappear in any circumstance. It goes on in all times. Not because of your circumstances, but in spite of your circumstances. And Isaiah is going to tell us what's going to give us this joy. He tells us in verse 6. He says, for us a child is born, and to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. Here's what we have to understand about the audience that Isaiah was writing to. Isaiah was writing, he was speaking to a group of people who were going through a very specific tragedy. He was writing to the nation of Israel. And the nation of Israel had fallen into dark times. They had been conquered by the Assyrian nation. They had been pillaged. They had been destroyed. Their people had been scattered. Their homes had been pillaged. And they were living in darkness. They weren't a free people, but they were a people that had been conquered. And they were looking forward to the time when they could be an independent nation again. And Isaiah says, you guys are people living in deep darkness, but a light on you will shine. God will multiply the nation. He will increase your joy. And how is He going to do that? He's going to give you a baby. Let's just think about for a moment how weird that is. I'm sure many of you have heard the story of David and Goliath multiple times. You know, you've got a towering 9-foot behemoth of a man versus a 12-year-old boy. And the odds aren't really great in that story. But how much worse would they be if you sent in an infant child? Not awesome. What Israel needed was a warrior. What they got was a baby. And if you read through the commentaries and you read through the scholars, what they'll tell you is a baby might seem like a bad gift, but it's really not, because it was supposed to be a kingly baby that would one day grow up to be a king. But even that's not awesome. They were looking for instant vindication, and they got delayed gratification. They didn't get the answer they were looking for. And even though they did end up getting a baby boy, and even though he would come up to be the Savior of the world, he still wasn't the warrior that he was expecting. Rather, he was a man who would one day go to call himself gentle and lowly at heart. He didn't come in swinging a sword. He himself said he came to bring peace. It wasn't the person that they thought they needed. And so often Jesus isn't the person that we think that we needed. But Isaiah goes on and he describes who this baby will be. He's not just going to be any baby. It says that his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. It's a very loaded name that tells us a whole lot about who this baby will be. Wonderful Counselor means that he's wise. He's discerning. He knows what the right decision to make at any moment is. And when you look at the life of Jesus, you see that time and time again. He spoke with wisdom. He taught well. He gave us the greatest handbook on moral teachings that the world has ever known. And yet it's more than that. He was wise. He was a wonderful counselor. But he's not just wise enough to know what to do. He's a mighty God, which means he's powerful enough to do it. He's not just the guy who comes up to you over and over again with great ideas that never finishes them. No, he's a wonderful counselor, but he's also a mighty God. He's actually powerful enough to do the things he said he was going to do. And the image shifts pretty dramatically from here. These first two tell us of a God who's wise and who's powerful. And most of us don't really struggle with that. We don't wrestle with that. What we often wonder is not, is God wise and is he powerful? That's not the thing that steals our joy. So often we wonder, is he good? And that's where this third title comes into play. He's our everlasting Father. I think one of the most powerful things that Satan can try and convince us of is that your God is a bad dad. I had a friend growing up who, whenever we'd get into group prayer circles, and maybe he did this personally, I don't know, I can only tell you what he prayed out loud, but whenever he'd pray out loud, we'd gather together in a circle and he'd say, "Hey, Dad." And then he'd go on to finish his prayer. And I remember growing up, I always thought that was the weirdest thing I've ever heard. This man just called God Dad. What is wrong with him? Does he know who he's talking to? And yet, Isaiah says that's exactly who he is. He is your good Father. And notice the word everlasting here. It doesn't mean he's your Father sometimes. It doesn't mean sometimes he's there and sometimes he's not. Sometimes he cares about you and sometimes he's away on a business trip. That's not what it means. He is always and everlasting your Father. He cares about you deeply. He will always care about you. He loves you like a good dad loves his child. That's who Jesus is for you. He loves you deeply. And then the last one is he's the Prince of Peace. He didn't came to sow destruction and chaos and confusion, but he came to bring a kingdom of peace, a kingdom of wholeness, a kingdom of prosperity for the nation, a kingdom that reunites the people with their God. That's who Jesus is. And what I really love about this text is that it's not a list of things for you and I to do. So often when we look for joy, we look for things to do. We go to the Bible and say, what am I doing wrong? What do I need to be doing better? How can I change so that I can experience real, everlasting joy in my life? And what this text says is that it's not about what you've done. It's about what Jesus did. There's no gift you can bring to God that will give you joy back. God has given you the gift that brings you joy. He gave you a light. He gave you a child. He gave you the wonderful counselor that you needed. He gave you the mighty God that you needed, the everlasting Father that you craved, and the Prince of Peace that could give you real wholeness and satisfaction and fulfillment in your life. And that is what brings joy. That is what brings real, everlasting, fruitful joy, because it's not based on what you've done. It's based on what he did. And that means that our joy isn't dependent on our circumstance. We don't get joy from our circumstance. Our joy doesn't our circumstances don't define our joy. Our joy defines our circumstances. What I love about this text is that God's playing the long game here. This isn't a short-term solution. He's sending a baby. And when he sends that baby, it's not going to immediately change the people of Israel's circumstance. But they can have joy and they can have hope in spite of what they're going through, because they know that their God is faithful to fulfill his promises. Growing up, my favorite Christmas songs were the ones that were super upbeat, super jazzy, that got you dancing, that got you partying, that you wanted to scream along to in the radio in the car. Those were my favorite Christmas songs, and over the last few years, my taste in Christmas songs has changed pretty dramatically. I much more prefer the somber, soft, acoustic Christmas songs anymore. And specifically, one has really caught my attention. The song, O Come, Emmanuel. It's probably my favorite Christmas song right now. And we're going to do a really cool thing over the next several weeks where at the end of each sermon, we're going to sing this song, and we're going to add a verse each week. So this week, we're going to sing just the first verse. And I want to read it to you so we have a moment to reflect over these lyrics. Because I think you'll get why I love this so much. The first verse says this, O come, Emmanuel, God with us, and ransom captive Israel that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appear. It captures the heart of where you and I are. So often we feel the need to be merry and bright. We feel the need to be joyful. We feel the need to be super excited about the Christmas season. But if we're honest, most of us don't feel that way naturally right now. We don't feel the merry and bright that Christmas is supposed to bring. And so we put on a face and we put on a facade and we go into family gatherings and we pretend that everything's all right, when in reality we're really frustrated, we're really heartbroken, we feel lonely, we feel down. And what I'm here to tell you today is Christmas isn't for those who pretend that they're in the light. It's for those who know that they're living in darkness, because on them a light has shone. They have hope. And that's what the chorus of O Come, Emmanuel is all about. It says, rejoice, rejoice. Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. It means that your circumstances right now aren't the last word. And maybe my favorite thing about the Advent season, and especially about this song, is that we have the hope to look back to what Jesus has done. To look back to Jesus coming the first time, where he brought joy and he brought hope and he brought peace and he brought love. And he came to fulfill the work that he did. But we don't just have the hope of the past, we also have the hope of the future. Advent isn't just about Jesus' first coming, it's also about his second. It's about the fact that right now there's pain and there is suffering and there is loss in this world, and all of that is very real, and we feel that. But there will be a day where there is no more pain, where there is no more suffering, where there are no more tears. And we can have joy in the midst of what we're going through right now, because we can look back to what Jesus did, how he came for us, how he came to bring God's presence to this earth. But we can also have joy because we know what he will do, that he'll come back to bring perfect joy, to bring perfect peace, to bring perfect love for all of us. That is what Jesus came to do. So we can hold on to joy that's not defined by our circumstances, but joy that defines our circumstances. Because when we're in darkness, Jesus brings us joy, real joy that's everlasting. Because even though we are a people walking in deep darkness, on us a light has shone. So will you please stand and join me in singing this song to our God?
O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel, that mourns in lonely exile here, until the Son of God appears. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. You may be seated.